to Dialogue Across Difference, an event series hosted by the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. Join us as Center Director Larry Jacobs and guests engage in conversations across the political and policy spectrum on issues of the day.
Hello, welcome. I am Larry Jacobs, I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs, where I direct the Center for the Study of Politics and Governance, which is bringing you today's program. One of our traditions here in our public events is to get you involved in the conversation. You will see at the bottom of your screen a Q&A button. Please use that, send us questions. We love all sorts of questions, including challenging questions. If you'd like to see our discussion today move in a different direction, give us your questions. That's the way we do it here. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's program, Timely Conversations, Rent Stabilization, Ballot Initiatives. Here in Minneapolis and St. Paul, there's going to be an election on Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, November 2nd. Timely Conversations is a format that we use that allows a distinguished university faculty member to enter into dialogue with a policymaker and advocate. Today's topic is going to be ballot questions at St. Paul and Minneapolis regarding the stabilization of rent. The important topics that we're going to be covering today will be: what is the problem and what is being proposed? Why did it develop, and what's the history behind the issues surrounding rent and housing? We're also going to be talking about the campaigns and debate over rent stabilization in Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're very fortunate to have at the Humphrey School Professor Ed Goetz. He is professor of urban and regional planning here at the Humphrey Schools. He specializes in housing and local community development and planning and policy. He's served on a number of local and national advisory committees regarding affordable housing and community development. He's director at the Humphrey School and the University of Minnesota of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. He's the author of one of the studies on rent stabilization in Minneapolis. In addition, Dr. Goetz has published 4 books: Shelter Burden, published in 1993, Clearing the Way, was published in 2003 and won a distinguished award from the Planning Association. In 2013, he published New Deal Ruins. And then in 2018, he published The One-Way Street of Integration. Joining Dr. Goetz will be Jennifer Arnold, who's director of Inquilinxs United Renters for Justice, which developed out of the Lindale Neighborhood Association. Ms. Arnold is well known for her work in helping tenants living in apartment buildings to get organized. And she's been quite active in the debate and campaigns relating to rent stabilization, the ballot initiative here in the Twin Cities. Without further ado, I welcome my colleague, Dr. Ed Goetz.
Thank you very much, Larry, for that introduction. And it's my pleasure to be here today. It's also my great pleasure to be able to speak with Jennifer Arnold. Welcome to you too, Jennifer. I thought we would start at the beginning, so to speak, and talk a little bit about where we find ourselves right now in a kind of a crisis of affordable housing. More than half of all renter households with children across the country are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. It's a widespread crisis of affordability, and it's a deep crisis of affordability. And your organization is an organization of renters, and so what is it that you're hearing about people's experiences out there?
Yeah, I guess the first thing that comes up for me is I have in this campaign season faced the question about, doesn't it mean that rents are affordable, that people keep paying them? And so I think what comes up when you first ask that question is that housing is different than other goods on the market, right? Because it's a necessity for families. And so what it looks like for families is making it work at all costs. And that means doubling up. That means having a lot of people in one place. That means getting another job, really finding any way to make it work. And I think that puts immense strain on families. And another thing that I think of is the way that I've seen, you all have studied and documented the way that neighborhoods in Minneapolis have changed. But even in my organizing in the last 6 years, we've seen it. So some of the first buildings that we organized in Minneapolis were, there's a set of apartment buildings between Lake and 31st, Pillsbury and Pleasant. There's like 10 buildings there that we've organized in for 6-7 years. And at the beginning, they were entirely Latino buildings, Latino families living there. And now I would say of the families that we first started working with, there's probably 25% or 20% that are still there. And the folks moving in are generally not people of color. They tend to be white people with dogs, which is noticeable for the families that are still there that were originally there. And really, it means folks are moving to find a place that's more affordable. To Richfield, to other places. And those moves are really disruptive for families, right? And for people's jobs, because most of the folks that we work with, a lot of folks we work with don't have cars. And so public transportation is the option. So it's really disruptive to have to move, especially to a different part of the city.
Right. And so you're seeing more displacement in the local market over the last 5 to 10 years?
We've definitely seen it. Yeah. It's really hard to name because we're not tracking it in a statistical way. But, when I look around, so Inquilinxs started out of work that I was doing in the Lindale neighborhood 10 years ago. And the Lindale neighborhood at the time, and it's very different than what it was. There were definitely pockets of strong pockets of the Latino community in that neighborhood. And I see that changing. I've seen that changing in the last 10 years in a really noticeable way.
Right. And some of the research that we've done up at Kira included looking at some of these patterns of gentrification that have occurred. And we do see it in parts of the north side, parts of the south side, as you've described, and parts of St. Paul as well. And where do you see the families moving to? Where are they finding alternative places?
With the Latino community in Lindale, we've seen a lot of people move to Richfield and Bloomington. I think folks have tried to stay around the neighborhood and do when they can. And also a lot of our original members have moved to Richfield and Bloomington. And that means, like I named initially, I'm thinking of a family specifically where it means a upheaval in the school for kids and a job change for parents, because that's quite far away from where folks were before.
Right.
Yeah, we've had quite a few members who have moved south.
The first point that you made regarding being able to pay your rent and demonstrating therefore that it's affordable. Researchers who look at that talk about a concept they call shelter poverty, which is oftentimes your rent is the first thing you have to pay so that you keep a roof over your head, but leaving you insufficient funds for the rest of the month for the various other expenses that the family has. So people, even people who aren't displaced, are actually feeling that crunch of affordability as well. How does that show up?
Yeah, I think that that concept is really helpful, actually. And I think of a couple different things when I think of that. First of all, yeah, I mean, I think the way it shows up is people double up, right? Children move back in with their parents, families move in together so that they're, it's very common within our membership that a family of 5 is living in a 1-bedroom apartment, for example. People do what they have to do to get by. And it does mean that there are impacts on the family, right? Everybody's like real pushed in next to each other. Or someone's renting a space that's not really supposed to be rented. But like you were saying, it's because it is the thing that gets paid first. I think the other things that you see as a result of that are food insecurity for families, not having all of the supplies for school. Those needs play out because people know they have to pay rent first. The other thing that comes up for me is that oftentimes landlords use credit scores to determine if someone is safe to rent to or not. And like you were naming, that's not usually actually a good indicator because people pay rent first. So even if they have debt from other things and a bad credit score, that doesn't mean they're not going to pay rent, because it is so crucial for families that they pay their rent.
Right. So this doubling up, it's in many cases, in many ways, really the kind of hidden problem of our housing market. National estimates are that up to 12% of households double up at any given point in time, which is, nationally millions of people. And, our own research has shown that this strains the relationships on both sides, right? It's very difficult to be the host family. It's very difficult to be the family that is moving in. What do you, is this something that's happening more frequently?
I mean, it's hard to say exactly, but I guess what comes up for me is also like alternative economies when you name that, right? Like families are looking for whatever makes it work. So when we organize in buildings, the strategy that we always use is that we talk to everybody renting from the same landlord, and we get everyone together and we say, what do you need? What do you need from your landlord? What's happening in your building? You're the expert. You know what's happening here. And we always come up with a similar list, right? The repair issues that are problematic throughout the city are kind of the same. There's infestations of bed bugs, cockroaches, mice, sometimes rats. People are treated poorly by the owner. And then increasing rents, which are happening all the time. And inevitably, when we do that process, their neighbor tensions show up. And neighbor tensions show up because of issues in the alternative economy that I would name. And I would include having to double up as part of that, right? Like it just puts strain on all the relationships. So doubling up is part of that. I ran into a case of like someone selling meat out of their freezer in their home. There's many versions of the alternative economy that show up. And this happens again because people are doing everything that they can to stay in their home and to stay stable. And so organizing in rental buildings requires more than just organizing people against their landlord. It's also organizing for solidarity and understanding for those things as they show up.
And we haven't even talked about the pandemic yet. And so I think it's fairly widely known that there were real concerns about a kind of tsunami of evictions coming as people's incomes were interrupted by the pandemic. That was stayed perhaps for some period of time by the moratorium on evictions. The federal government and local governments have tried to get emergency assistance to tenants. I guess I would ask what you can tell us about whether those policy responses have been effective.
Mixed results, right? I had phone calls during the pandemic. I would say some of the hardest times in the pandemic were when we were getting phone calls from folks who didn't have food and called us because they thought that we could support them with rent. I remember having a conversation with a woman who said, I heard I could call you about my rent. And I said, do you have food in your house? And she said, no. So the eviction moratorium was a good thing. And because it was a month-to-month situation here in Minnesota, it wasn't something that people felt like they could count on. They always were scrambling to make up that rent. And, there were a lot of families that didn't qualify for other kinds of support. And so we're doing that scrambling while they also didn't have basic necessities for their kids. And it was, that pressure was terrible. We had been advocating at that time to cancel rent. And really it was about taking the pressure away from that landlord-tenant relationship, where tenants always felt like, even if there was a moratorium, they always felt like, I need to be responsible for this. And what does that mean? So we knew of families that went into debt to pay the rent, credit card debt, other kinds of debt, which is actually really scary. I met people in Powderhorn Park who had been evicted by assault by their landlord, right? So there was an eviction moratorium, but the landlord assaulted the tenant and locked him out. And, by the time I met him, there was nothing we could do to reverse that. So we know that these policies were good. And we also know that there were a lot of people who didn't know about them and a lot of landlords who didn't care. A lot of evictions that happen don't happen in court. So even though there couldn't be court proceedings, didn't mean landlords couldn't evict tenants. And it did happen during the pandemic. And we saw an increase in our population living outside during the pandemic. And there's no doubt that that was why. I mean, I met people that was why. And now, our organization and organizations like ours have been talking to folks who have applied for assistance. And that assistance has been so slow, so confusing, so difficult to access. And so we are still concerned about, the eviction moratorium off-ramp sort of happened in waves, and we're still watching in a really close way about what this means for our membership and, more importantly, people who aren't connected to organizations like ours. Because, we, like I said earlier, we work with people who all rent from the same landlord, and we work with people over a long period of time. So we work with people for repairs, but then we work when there's rent increases and when there's evictions. And we're like a place people can go to actually fight back against those things. But most tenants don't have that option. You can get legal help, but by the time you're in court, it's a really scary situation and much more challenging.
And the slowness of the emergency rental assistance has been a problem really across the country. And I think it has to do with the ability to create an infrastructure for moving that assistance in a timely manner. It's been unfortunate that that's been such a challenge in so many different places.
Yes, that's totally right. I think the other thing I want to point to, we haven't really talked about all this, but this housing crisis, which was exacerbated by the pandemic, is years in the making. This started with when there was major disinvestment in public housing, specifically in the 80s. And before that, and the move from public housing to funding affordable housing tax credits, and really what that has meant for the longevity of and the government's investment in housing as infrastructure, as a need for community. And so we're in this place where it's a serious crisis that has been created by a long-term issue. So as we talk about rent stabilization, I think it's important to understand that context.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Various changes in our public policy approach to housing have in the end sort of reduced our commitment to affordable housing compared to where it stood in previous generations. But I think part of it is also an income problem, right? We have steadily rising costs of operating housing, of building housing. But in many cases, especially for a particular segment of the population, incomes just haven't kept pace. And so given that kind of scenario, I mean, we can talk about reinvigorating public housing, for building new affordable housing. We can talk about the limitations of the tax credit program that you described. Many of the housing units that are built through the tax credit program are not seen as being all that affordable in some neighborhoods, right? Even when you're using the income limits that apply to that program, unless you're layering on additional subsidies, you're not really producing housing that's going to be affordable to people with, at 30 or 40% of the median income nearby. So how does rent stabilization then sort of fit into the toolbox of things that we have to address this situation?
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of naming it. It's one tool in the toolbox. I think it's a cornerstone. It's an important tool, and I want to name a little bit why. I think first of all, rent stabilization is so basic that people think it already exists. Like our membership, I can't tell you how many times our membership has called saying, "Hey, my rent's going up $300. How's that legal?" Right? Like it feels so violating to have your rent increased an exorbitant amount. It's like minimum wage, right? It just feels like it should already be there because it's so patently unfair to have such a huge rent increase. And I've always had to say, yeah, that's rent control or rent stabilization, and we don't have that. So it's a basic policy that can serve as a protection against price gouging, these huge jumps in rent increases that we see. We've worked in buildings where that kind of rent increase has displaced everybody living there, right? That happened in Crossroads when it turned to concierge. That is a practice that is done that is really disruptive for an entire community when it happens. And so a rent stabilization policy is protection against that kind of exorbitant increase. And it's not going to solve the housing crisis, and it is the most cost-effective universal policy that can have the biggest impact on rent prices, because it is something that can cover all rental housing and serve as that protection. So I would say it's the Band-Aid we need while we fix the crisis using other tactics as well, right? It is a short-term solution that helps us implement the other things that we need to do to really impact the housing market. And in the interim, it keeps people where they live, right? So this problem I named about what I see in Lindale is with a rent stabilization policy, those families could have stayed in place because they could have known this is what rent will increase every year. I can count on it, and it is something that is doable for my family. Whereas the jumps that those families have seen, $150 rent increase all at once, is something that folks can't live with.
Right. I think that's an important point that you make here right at the end, which is that rent stabilization is fairly well targeted to the issue of housing stability. Right. It does. Among the things that it does, this is one that you can sort of really point to as being one of the outcomes of rent stabilization. It gives families a certain amount of predictability in terms of what the rent is going to be going forward. And you sort of led some of your remarks early in our conversation about displacement. And I think that's probably one thing rent stabilization does pretty well, is to help prevent displacement.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the research that y'all did showed that.
Yeah, and it showed in our analysis anyway of the Minneapolis market that it would have its major impact on the very large rent increases that were occurring in the market. For most of the period that we studied from 2001 to 2019, most rent increases were pretty modest and probably would not have been affected too much by a rent cap. But in the post-crisis years after the foreclosure crisis, when rents began to increase and you started seeing larger rent increases, that's when the 1A program might have had its biggest impacts to avoid those kinds of large increases. So, what do you, so the other thing, perhaps before we think about going to some questions that we're getting is, you know, I'd like to talk about the strategies you are pursuing and your organization is pursuing to make the argument in favor of rent stabilization. The opponents have raised close to $4 million and are spending that, and you don't quite have those resources. And so I'm wondering, are you worried about getting your message out, and how are you sort of approaching that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think looking at the opposition's $4 million, you can see it's coming from big developers and it's coming from folks around the country, right? It shows fear, specifically, I would name, of the St. Paul policy. So we haven't gotten to this, but in Minneapolis and St. Paul, we have a different situation. So we all have to have something on the ballot because of preemption at the state level. But in St. Paul, there is a policy on the ballot, whereas in Minneapolis, there is the authorization for a policy on the ballot, basically a change to the city charter. And that's because the Minneapolis and St. Paul charters are different. So I think the opposition has looked at both places and fought against it, but I see them fighting harder in St. Paul because of the specifics of the policy. Don't get me wrong, I think whatever the specifics of the policy would be, they would fight hard. It's because they're at that point in the process. Yeah, I think, you know, we do what we can do best, which is talk to voters, which is what we've been doing in both campaigns, is going out and knocking doors and calling folks on the phone. And I think something important to name here is that renters, of course, are the folks who are most likely to vote in favor of a policy like this. And actually, if you look at the polling, it shows that folks, I think it's over 45, are much more likely to vote against it than folks under. And I would name that it's probably about proximity to renting, what it means to have you know, have experience in the rental market that you can remember. And also, you know, I think life has been different for my generation and younger, who have been more likely to rent for longer because of the housing crisis and what it did to our prospects economically. And so I think we're doing what we can do best, which is talking to people, getting into apartment buildings, urging people to vote. We know that the electorate in both Minneapolis and St. Paul tends to be older and white and homeowning as a, you know, on average. And so for us, it's both about getting folks who are less likely to vote to come out and vote, and do some persuasion with folks who are likely voters.
So you made an important distinction between the St. Paul and the Minneapolis efforts, noting that in Minneapolis, the ballot initiative is really about getting authorization so that the council and mayor can then pursue a process of developing a policy. Do you have particular things you would like to see in a policy? Because I think one of the things that we saw in the study that we did for the city is that the potential outcomes of a rent stabilization program depend fairly importantly on the specific design elements of the program.
Yep.
Are there some things you'd like to see out of this effort in Minneapolis?
Yeah, that's a great question. we're still negotiating in our coalition with what we think the best policy will be. I like the option that St. Paul put on the ballot, and I think it gives us a really good starting point to discuss. The key questions are going to be, what is the percent increase, right? So in St. Paul, that's 3%. And then the second one is, what are the carve-outs? Like, what are the buildings that it doesn't apply to? So we know places where single-family homes are carved out. And I just want to name that if that were to happen in Minneapolis, that would be a serious racial justice issue. The north side, where so many Black families live, is populated primarily with single-family homes. So, and now they're being rented, sometimes by private equity companies to folks living on the north side. So it feels very important that that exemption is not made. Sometimes there are exemptions called vacancy decontrol, which is when someone moves out of an apartment, the landlord can raise the rent however much they want. In St. Paul, that exemption is not in place. And I would agree. I don't think there should be vacancy decontrol. I think it weakens the policy. And then I think the last question is usually about exempting buildings within a certain amount of time when they've been built. In St. Paul, again, there is no exemption. The policy goes into place from the minute it's built. And the justification is that the developer can set the price at whatever they want to set it at. And so I think that's a great policy. And I also know that we have a lot to negotiate here in Minneapolis. We're in a different situation, and we will have to negotiate about all of those pieces as we come up with our version of the policy.
Right. I'd like to stay with the vacancy decontrol for 1 second, just to make sure that we've defined it fully, right? Vacancy control or decontrol simply refers to whether the caps remain in place when a vacancy in a unit occurs. Vacancy decontrol will allow for an owner or landlord to then increase the rent to any level when there is a vacancy. And then when the new household is in place, then the caps continue from that point forward. A vacancy control doesn't allow that, right? And then there are some options in between for a partial decontrol, et cetera. I think it's probably also worth noting that when we modeled the market in Minneapolis over the last 15 years, we assumed vacancy control, and the numbers seem to indicate that investors could still realize their desired rates of return even in that scenario. That had to do with the prevailing market at the time. So sorry to go on about that, but I thought that was probably worth
well, I mean, and what matters about it is that the St. Paul policy was written using the research that you all did, and the 3% that was put in that is on the ballot in St. Paul actually comes out of that research, which I think you could talk to at greater length.
Yes, but and we may, but there are some questions. We've been getting some interesting questions through the Q&A feature, and I thought that I might want to go to a couple of those. Some of those questions take us back to previous points, which I'll try to get to, but there's one here about rent stabilization versus rent subsidies, and whether those approaches may conflict, or are they policies that can coexist and be co-beneficial? Jennifer, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that they can coexist and are co-beneficial. I think there's different ways to do rent subsidies. But if you're talking about vouchers, for example, I believe that we should expand our voucher program that we have in the state of Minnesota, because right now, most families who apply for a voucher are on the waiting list for years before, the waiting list, I think, is going to open up November 4th. It's always notable. It opens for a day and it gets so many people on the list that people don't get vouchers for years after signing up. So I believe that it should be expanded. And the nice thing about pairing the policies together is actually that then we know when we're publicly subsidizing a tenant's rent that the rent is fair. Because right now, there's a bunch of regulations around vouchers that can make it complicated and limit where the tenant can actually spend the voucher, because if it's too expensive, the tenant isn't allowed to use the voucher in that housing. And so I think some kind of controls on the amount that rent goes up actually benefits the voucher system. I don't know if you have any additions to that, Ed, but that's sort of my reaction.
Right. I think that they are complementary approaches. I think that the subsidies face ongoing kinds of budgetary pressures. That is, every year, the legislative body, whether it's the city council or the state legislature or Congress, has to sort of budget that money in, and that can limit expenditures over time. The other thing that's worth noting is, most low-income families don't live in subsidized housing. We just don't have a lot of subsidized housing in the United States. Most low-income families are living in the private market, and so for them, subsidies aren't a possibility, and that's where other alternative approaches may come in handy. So let's go back to the conversation we were having about doubling up, because we have a question here about whether doubling up is always a negative thing, where sometimes intergenerational living is by design and can have positive effects and outcomes. Jennifer, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally about choice. Who gets to make the decision about that, right? Like, I think it's great that people choose to double up and live together. I think there's so many benefits in that. And is it happening because of a family feeling forced because of the cost of rent? Or is it happening because the family's choosing to do that? So, I mean, I think that's fundamentally the question, is who gets to decide what's happening there? And also, is the housing, is there space enough for the people who are there? And again, that should be a question that the family gets to decide. It's not a question that I feel like I need to answer for a family. How much space do you need? I think folks get to decide that for themselves. But what we're naming is, and the research shows, is that people are making this decision because they feel forced to, not because it's a decision that they're freely coming to.
We're being asked to sort of elucidate a little bit more the arguments against rent stabilization and rent control. And so these are topics that we covered in the report that we did, and we looked at empirical studies of the way rent stabilization programs have operated around the country to see the extent to which these negative outcomes occur. And I think the first argument against it is that it will be a disincentive to new development, so that developers will stop or slow down the building of new rental housing when there are rent controls institute. The second is that rent stabilization may produce a decline in maintenance, and therefore a decline in the quality of the housing as well. And the third argument against it is that it may actually reduce the amount of housing and or affordable housing in the marketplace as landlords or other owners will remove units from the market, either through demolition or through conversion to condominiums to take them out of the rented stock. And our study showed that that in fact, most rent stabilization programs are designed in ways that make those outcomes less problematic than most people fear. In terms of the new construction, There are usually exemptions for new construction for 15 years, sometimes longer. Jennifer, you've made an argument that even without an exemption, new development may not be affected. But generally speaking, we don't see that outcome in across the country in programs. The maintenance effect, the research really shows that major components of a building's health, the major structural components, typically do not suffer because most programs allow owners to pass those costs through, and these become exceptions to the rent cap. So natural disasters, another tornado, hopefully not through the city, causing that kind of those kinds of problems, or even if your boiler goes or your roof goes, are typically capital improvements that are allowed to be passed along in an amortized way to renters. The research does find, however, that smaller and more cosmetic maintenance does sometimes suffer as owners sort of shift their spending patterns. And then the other outcome that I think the literature shows is that, in fact, in some places, landlords and owners do pull units off of the market, and they do so by converting to condominium. Sometimes when there are exemptions for owner occupied or for the family of owners, we see that exemption being utilized more frequently. And then we see, in some cases, actual outright demolition of units and the rebuilding of new units if there is a new construction exemption. So, so those things do tend to happen occasionally in the market. Jennifer, what are your sort of reactions to those?
Yeah, I guess I think a couple things. One is that this never was a policy that was going to solve all problems with the housing market. And so I think, you know, it is one thing, and it does a certain set of things really well within the market. I think it needs to be paired with other strategies, which include, you know, public housing development and other public investments in housing to counteract some of the, for example, if there is less housing in the market as a result. You know, like you were naming, I'm not worried that people are going to stop developing, because I think that's a threat that's just always used by the landlord lobby. I've heard that too many times when implementing other kinds of policies. And I think the research doesn't bear it out. So I don't think it's going to break anything, right? And we get to do other things as well to counteract some of the other impacts that it has. I think the benefits for renters are so strong that it's worth doing anyway. And the other thing I would name about repairs is that, you know, we primarily work in buildings where we start the conversation around repairs. There already exists in the Twin Cities serious repair issues in certain sets of buildings. And landlords that are specifically, I would say, targeting Black, immigrant, Indigenous, and people of color to actually exploit through practices that are about not making repairs. And a rent stabilization policy actually gives people more leverage, more, you know, the power relationship between a landlord and tenant is it's really clear. And having a little bit more assurance about what it means for your rent when you ask for repairs actually supports the tenant in being able to leverage the things that they can to get the repairs that they need. And so I think, you know, the question about repairs actually, you know, a policy is helpful for people. So, you know, that's generally where I land. And the reminder again, that this is not a panacea. This is not the policy that solves the housing crisis. It never was supposed to be. It's the policy that's about keeping people in their homes And actually, I think of it as a Band-Aid in a moment of crisis, which is what we're in. And then we need to keep fighting to actually get justice in housing, which means, you know, a right to a home. We should live in a society where we have a home for everybody who lives here.
Right. A more fundamental question, to be sure.
Yes.
We're seeing a number of questions that in one way or another relate to concerns about limiting revenues of landlords and property owners. To begin to get at that, one of the questions is, what are the sensible numbers for a rent cap? Should it be 6%? Should it be higher, lower? One mayoral candidate is calling for 3%, like the St. Paul program. What is your sense about what a reasonable or effective rent cap would be?
Yeah. I mean, again, I think this is something that is still up for negotiation. But when I think about our membership, I think about what does this mean for them? That's really where I have to start. And I know that a $50 rent increase, which is a 5% cap in a $1,000 building or $1,000 rental unit is too high for our membership. And this is why, you know, organizationally, I know that our members are going to want a 3% cap, because this is what I think our members can understand will work for them year after year. I think there's questions within that as what does it mean if we're in a time of increased inflation, and what does it mean? So I'm interested in thinking about what does flexibility in something like that mean. But I know that right now, 3% is what our members can put up with. And something I just want to name is that landlord profits are not something that is publicly talked about or looked at. The only reason that I have any sense of this at all is that we've been in court with landlords. And, you know, one of the landlords that we had a large public fight against for 5 years, through a court process, we discovered that he had 70% profit margins, which is insane. And I'm not saying that all landlords have that. I don't think that's a common thing. And it's incredible that is a possibility in landlording as it is now. That is an incredible profit margin that is basically taking working people's income to subsidize. And so, you know, I'm interested in, if there's going to be exemptions, let's look at your books. Let's see what's there. You know, we need some light on this. We need transparency to understand what will work.
And for reference, our study showed a wide range of rent caps. The most lenient, I think, we saw in the state of Oregon, which allows rent caps at the rate of inflation, which is the consumer price index, plus 7%. So for many years, that's an allowable set of rent increases up to about 10%. And so in that situation, that law is clearly just an anti-gouging law. That's where it will only have its effects. On the other end of the extreme is not St. Paul, by the way. It's Berkeley, California, which sets its cap at 65% of the consumer price index. So it's set at a level that will never actually equal inflation rate, no matter what the inflation rate is. And Santa Monica, California also has set it at a percentage of the consumer price index. So anywhere between those are levels that that communities have used and chosen across the country. And so that will be an interesting, as you say, negotiating point should the initiative pass in Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Let me see what other questions we may have here. I'm old enough to remember vividly year after year of double-digit inflation. St. Paul's rent stabilization proposes limits at 3% rather than tying them to the rate of inflation. How can we be confident that inflation will not reduce real rent levels year after year and thereby lead to disinvestment? Do you want to try that, or you want to let me?
I would love for you to answer that.
Well, so I don't know that there is a way we can be confident of that. I think what we can be confident of is that should inflation rates remain pretty high, first of all, I think it's the case that the majority of the St. Paul City Council has come out against the rent stabilization proposal. And my strong sense is, therefore, that probably as soon as they are statutorily able to amend that program, they probably will do so. And I guess that's my anticipation in response to this question, which is a great question. My guess is, I mean, rent stabilization programs are amended quite frequently. New York City just went through a big amendment. It does so every so many years. So what I anticipate is, should a program like the St. Paul program be enacted, and should it prove to be problematic for any reason, including the one that was described here, my guess is that it will be amended and it will be changed in ways that that are responsive. That is what one would hope from a functioning legislative body, and it would be what we would need to have happen as well. So. Do we know what percentage of Twin Cities rental housing is owned by individuals versus corporations, and how have those percentages been changing?
I like that question. Important.
What would be your answer to it then?
I don't remember off the top of my head. I do know, I remember there was a study in the city of Minneapolis about the percentage of rental license that are owned by, like larger companies versus mom and pop. I'm not remembering the details, but I know that has changed over time. In Minneapolis, we're not seeing like a takeover of corporate landlords. And by that, I mean like private equity, really big money. We are seeing them start to invade and encroach in the market. They have not like taken it over yet at this point. However, most rental housing is owned. I think it's something like 80% of the rental housing is owned by a small set of companies, and the remaining 20% is more like small landlords. And there are, I don't know if you all know about, there's like Invitation Homes and Pretium Partners. These are two large private equity companies that do own homes in the Twin Cities, and specifically on the north side of Minneapolis and parts of St. Paul. Pretium Partners, which is the second largest single family homeowner in the country, owns a bunch of single family homes. And those changes we started to see after the Great Recession, after 2008. Those private equity companies sort of sprung up and started buying the homes that were foreclosed during the market crash. And so we're at a good time to implement policies like this and other policies that can stop outside money, private equity specifically, from coming in and buying up homes. And the reason that I would name that that's really problematic is that private equity there's no transparency. So it's, they're owning all these homes, treating people really poorly. We're organizing with folks renting from Pretium Partners and see this. And it's very hard to get accountability because the money is dispersed and the people live far away. And so it's really hard to get accountability on what's happening in those homes.
Right. We're trying to get a handle on this question through research that we're doing at Cura. And it's true, we are seeing an uptick in LLC ownership. We're seeing an increase in non-local ownership. what's interesting is that the trend certainly kicked upward after the foreclosure crisis, but you began to see it even in the few years right before the foreclosure crisis. And from 2002 and 3 on, you start to see this phenomenon increase, but it does spike a bit after the foreclosure crisis for the reasons you described. It's a difficult question to research because really ownership is not very transparent in most public databases. You have lots of firsthand information on it. We're trying to get a more systematic assessment of it. We're at early stages. What will be the Minneapolis process for setting a policy if the ballot question passes? Does it ever go back to the voters?
That is a great question. So the specific language on the ballot allows for the city council to implement a policy, or for the city council to write a policy and put it to voters again. And it's not clear yet what's going to happen first, because because it's clear that if the city council were to write a policy, that it would be legally challenged and it may not pass the state law, the preemption law, which requires a policy to be voted on by the majority of the population through a referendum, majority of voters. And so it's unclear whether or not the vote this fall is enough to pass that, or if we're going to need a second referendum on the specifics of the policy. And so I would say most likely Minneapolis voters will get a chance to vote on the policy, but it will be written specifically by the council and there will be a process to get there. So it's not clear if that will happen in 2022 or in 2023, but most likely it will happen.
And if it does go back, if there is another round of voter approval, we're talking about another year, right? Because it has to go back onto the fall ballot, right? So that would put off the date of implementation?
Correct. Yeah. And again, that's really because of Minneapolis' city charter that we were not able to put a policy directly on the ballot this year.
Right. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you more broadly for the conversation. I appreciate your coming to us today and participating in this conversation. I will hand it back to Professor Jacobs now, but thank you again.
Thanks to both of you for a very informative conversation. We appreciate it, and it's really, I think, helped to widen our understanding of the housing questions in the Twin Cities and how we got to this point. Just want to quickly mention some of the programs that we have coming up. The first is a program on community organizing with Marshall Gantz, who's been one of the leading community organizers in the country. He'll be talking both about progressive efforts at community organizing, the strengths and some of the challenges, as well as some of the efforts among conservatives and those in the right to use some of the same techniques of community organizing. And what that means, that's coming up this Wednesday at 12 Central Time. We're going to have a program on health reform coming up November 17th at 12 Central. There is a tremendous amount of important changes in health reform subsidies and rules that is currently being negotiated in Washington as part of the President Biden's Build Back Better. And so we'll be unpacking that. We're going to have two outstanding analysts who work in DC and follow the policy closely. We're also going to have a program on November 19th at 12:15 Central Time. And the title of that is For Biden, Failure is an Option. We'll be joined by two Republican conservatives, Vin Weber, who hails from Minnesota originally, and Rich Lowry, who was the editor of the National Review. Three great programs all coming up. I want to also mention that This program, like all of our programs, will be shared in the next day or two on social media. You can either catch it on YouTube or it's available as a podcast. And here's all your favorite ways to access it on social media. Lots of people are following us now on social media. And if you'd like, you could sign up and get our programs as a matter of routine. I want to let you know that many of our programs require resources to put together. Staff time and when we get back in person, travel. They're all free and open to the public. And so we welcome contributions from individuals or corporations or nonprofits. Help us out. The center will be eager to work on the Give to the Max Day, which is coming up on November 18th. We're particularly going to focus on the Policy Fellows program, which is a unique program in the country. It focuses on leadership development. It brings together kind of a microcosm of Minnesota across the political spectrum, urban and rural. We bring in people who are from the military services, folks who are in the business sector, nonprofit, and government. It's a phenomenal program that was started over 30 years ago. And so think about that as an option for contributing to our work. Once again, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to thank our terrific guests, Ed Goetz and Jennifer Arnold. Thank you and have a great day.